There is a specific kind of silence that falls over a small town when a child goes missing. It is not the silence of peace or of evening or of ordinary things. It is the silence of collective breath held, of doors double-locked, of parents counting heads at dinner tables and coming up one short, of an entire community tilting on its axis because the thing everyone feared but never named has finally arrived. That silence fell over Figueira, a tiny village in the Algarve region of southern Portugal, on the night of September 12, 2004, when 8-year-old Joana Cipriano did not come home from the local shop where she had been sent to buy groceries. She was the kind of child people remember, dark-haired, bright-eyed, the sort of kid who waved at everyone she passed and made adults smile without even trying, and when she vanished without a trace on an ordinary Sunday evening in a village where everyone knew everyone, the questions that followed would tear families apart, expose corruption that reached into the highest levels of Portuguese law enforcement, and spark a debate about justice and truth that echoes to this very day. Here is what we know for certain about that evening. Joana left her home sometime around 7 in the evening, destination the small local shop a few minutes' walk from her house, the errand so routine, so unremarkable, that nobody thought twice about sending an 8-year-old girl alone, because this was 2004, in a village where people left their doors unlocked, where children played outside until dark without supervision, where the concept of stranger danger felt like something that happened in cities, not here, not in Figueira, not to them. She never arrived at the shop. The shopkeeper never saw her. And when her family realized she had not returned, when the minute stretched to an hour and the hour stretched to something darker, the search that followed would reveal not just the disappearance of a little girl but something far more disturbing about the people closest to her. What happened to Joana Cipriano is one of the most debated, most contested, most emotionally raw cold cases in modern Portuguese history, and the reason it remains so painful, so unresolved in the hearts of everyone who followed it, is because the story has no clean villain, no neat conclusion, no moment where justice arrives looking the way justice is supposed to look. Instead it has layers, contradictions, confessions that were retracted, evidence that disappeared, investigators who became suspects, and at the center of it all, the absence of a little girl who deserved so much better than what this world gave her. But before we understand what the investigators found, before we examine what the courts decided and what they got wrong and what they may have gotten right, we need to understand something fundamental about the world Joana Cipriano was born into, because the tragedy of this case did not begin on September 12, 2004, it began years earlier, in the choices and failures of the adults who were supposed to protect her, and when you understand the full picture of her life, the disappearance will make a horrifying kind of sense that is somehow worse than randomness. Pull up a chair, because this part of the story is not easy, and it is not simple, and it is the part that most true crime coverage of the Joana case glosses over because it makes the human heart uncomfortable in ways that a straightforward murder mystery does not. Joana Cipriano was not living an ordinary childhood in the months and years before she disappeared. She was a child growing up in poverty, in a household that social services had flagged more than once, in a situation that multiple people in the community were aware of and that nobody, not teachers, not neighbors, not social workers, not authorities, intervened in with sufficient urgency to make a difference. She was, in the language of official reports, a child at risk, and that designation, those 3 bureaucratic words, should haunt every system that touched her case and looked away. Her mother, Leonor Cipriano, was a woman whose own life had been shaped by hardship and poor choices and the kind of generational poverty that does not announce itself with drama but simply grinds people down over years and decades until they make decisions that outsiders cannot comprehend. Leonor was not a monster in the way that tabloid coverage wanted her to be. She was a damaged human being who had never been given the tools to be the parent her children needed, and that distinction matters not because it excuses what happened but because understanding it is the only way to understand how a child could disappear from under so many people's noses without anyone catching it in time. Joana also had an uncle, João Cipriano, her mother's brother, who lived nearby and who was a regular presence in the family's life, a presence that would later take on sinister significance when the investigation began to close in on the family circle. If you are watching right now from the United Kingdom, the United States, Canada, Australia, Portugal, Brazil, or anywhere else in the world, take a moment to subscribe to this channel, hit the like button, and turn on your notifications, because this case is one that deserves to be told carefully and completely, and we are just getting started with the layers of this story. The village of Figueira itself is important context, because it is the kind of place where privacy does not really exist in the way city dwellers understand it, where people know the business of their neighbors whether they want to or not, where news travels fast and judgment travels faster, and where the appearance of family solidarity can be maintained even when behind closed doors something is deeply wrong. Multiple people in Figueira would later tell investigators that they had concerns about Joana's welfare before her disappearance, that they had noticed things, heard things, seen things that did not sit right, but the calculus of small-town life, the reluctance to interfere in family matters, the fear of being wrong, the social cost of being the person who makes a call to authorities, all of these things kept those concerns quiet until it was too late. The night she disappeared, the last confirmed sighting of Joana Cipriano was by a neighbor who saw her walking in the direction of the shop, alive, unharmed, an ordinary child running an ordinary errand on an ordinary evening. After that, nothing. No one saw her at the shop. No one saw her walking back. No one saw her speaking to anyone. No one saw her get into a vehicle. She simply stepped off the visible edge of the world and did not step back onto it, and the vacuum her absence left behind would be filled, over the coming weeks and months, with suspicion, accusation, forced confession, and institutional betrayal on a scale that made the original crime almost secondary to the scandal that followed. The search that followed her disappearance was extensive, involving police, volunteers, military units, and eventually international attention, but it produced nothing, no body, no clothing, no physical trace of where Joana had gone or what had happened to her. And that absence of evidence was going to force investigators into a corner where they would make decisions that compromised the entire investigation and ultimately made it impossible to know with certainty what really happened. But the most chilling detail that emerged in the first 72 hours of the search, the detail that shifted the focus from stranger abduction to something much closer to home, came from an unlikely source, and it changed everything. Here is a truth about criminal investigations that television teaches us to forget and real life insists on reminding us of. The statistics are brutal and clear. When a child is harmed, when a child disappears, the perpetrator is almost never a stranger lurking in shadows. It is almost always someone known to the child, someone trusted, someone whose access was unremarkable and whose presence raised no alarm. And this statistical reality, combined with inconsistencies in the accounts given by Joana's family in those first critical hours, quickly turned the investigation's eyes toward the people closest to her. Leonor Cipriano, Joana's mother, gave a statement that raised immediate questions. Her account of the evening contained details that did not align with what neighbors had observed, timing that did not quite add up, and an emotional register that veteran investigators described as off, as somehow not matching what they expected from a mother whose child had just vanished. Now, grief is individual, and it is dangerous and often unjust to judge someone's emotional response to trauma against a standardized expectation of how grief should look. There is a long and ugly history of miscarriages of justice rooted in investigators deciding that someone did not cry enough or cried too much or seemed too calm or seemed too hysterical, all of which is deeply unreliable evidence of guilt. But the concerns about Leonor were not limited to her emotional presentation. They extended to concrete factual inconsistencies that could not be explained by grief or shock or the disorientation of trauma, and they extended too to the behavior of her brother João, who had been at the family home that evening and whose own account of events contained its own troubling gaps. The picture that began to emerge over the first week of the investigation was not the picture of a family in shock reaching out for help. It was the picture of a family circling the wagons, managing information, presenting a coordinated narrative that seemed designed more to protect itself than to find a missing child. Investigators noted that Leonor did not join search parties with the urgency they expected, that she seemed more focused on what questions police were asking than on the search itself, and that her interactions with other family members when she thought she was not being observed looked less like people sharing grief and more like people coordinating stories. João Cipriano came under particular scrutiny early in the investigation. His background was known to local police, He was not a man with an unblemished record, and his presence in the family home on the night of Joanna's disappearance, combined with his vague and shifting account of his own movements that evening, made him a person of significant interest to investigators almost immediately. The relationship between Leonor and João, beyond being simply siblings, was one that people in the village described in terms that suggested unusual closeness, unusual dependence, the kind of dynamic that made people uncomfortable without quite being able to articulate why. And then, approximately 10 days into the investigation, something happened that would either crack the case open or, depending on which side of the argument you stand on, destroy any hope of finding the truth about what happened to Joana Cipriano, because both Leonor and João made statements that the prosecution would present as confessions and that the defense would argue were extracted through means that no civilized legal system should tolerate, and at the heart of the controversy is a question that Portugal's courts have been arguing about ever since: can a confession obtained through torture ever be the foundation of justice, and what does it mean for a society when the people charged with finding the truth become part of the crime themselves? This is where the Joana Cipriano case becomes something that goes beyond a missing child and becomes a story about the soul of a justice system, about what investigators are willing to do when they believe they know the answer and need only force the evidence to confirm it. Leonor Cipriano and her brother João were taken in for questioning by the Polícia Judiciária, Portugal's elite criminal investigation unit, within the first weeks of the disappearance. What happened during those interrogation sessions is disputed with a ferocity that has never fully resolved itself in the legal or public record of this case, but what is not disputed are the injuries that Leonor Cipriano bore when she emerged from custody, injuries that were documented by medical personnel and that she attributed to beatings administered by the detectives questioning her. Leonor's injuries were extensive and severe, consistent with sustained physical assault rather than accidental injury or self-infliction, and she immediately alleged that she had been beaten repeatedly during interrogation, that the confession she gave was given not because she was telling the truth but because the pain was unbearable and she would have said anything to make it stop. This allegation, if true, would represent not just a criminal assault on a detainee but a catastrophic contamination of the entire investigation, because any confession obtained through torture is legally worthless, morally indefensible, and practically disastrous for any subsequent prosecution because it poisons the well of everything that follows. The confession she gave, the one she later retracted and attributed to coercion, described the death of Joanna as occurring at the family home, described the involvement of both herself and João, and provided details about the disposal of Joanna's body that, investigators noted, contained specifics that only someone present could have known. This is the argument that prosecution supporters have always made: how could she have known those details unless she was there? How could the confession contain information that had not been made public unless it was genuine? And it is a serious argument, one that the courts wrestled with at length, but it runs directly into the counter-argument that has never been satisfactorily answered, which is that those details could have been fed to her by investigators during questioning, could have been inserted into the confession after the fact, could have been known to her through other means entirely, and without an independent record of the interrogation, without audio or video of what actually happened in that room, there is no way to know for certain. João Cipriano, who also confessed during this period and who also subsequently retracted his confession claiming coercion and physical abuse, would later become a central figure in the scandal that engulfed the investigation. But before we get to that scandal, before we examine what happened to the investigators themselves and the extraordinary twist that made this case a landmark in Portuguese legal history, we need to understand what the investigation actually found, what physical evidence existed to support or contradict the confessions, and why the absence of a body has complicated this case in ways that no amount of testimony or confession could ever fully resolve. When you build a murder case without a body, you are building on sand, and every lawyer who has ever tried such a case will tell you that while it is not impossible, while convictions have been secured without physical remains, the absence of a body creates vulnerabilities in a prosecution that skilled defense attorneys will exploit at every turn, and rightly so, because the body is the primary evidence of the crime itself. It establishes cause of death, it preserves forensic trace evidence, it makes the reality of the crime undeniable in a way that testimony and confession and circumstantial evidence can never quite achieve. In the Joana Cipriano case, investigators found blood evidence in the family home, biological material consistent with serious injury or death, trace evidence of cleaning attempts that suggested someone had tried to remove evidence after an incident, and various other physical details that painted a picture of violence having occurred on the premises. The blood evidence was significant and formed the backbone of the physical case against the family, because it was found in locations and in quantities that spoke to something beyond ordinary injury, and the evidence of cleaning, of attempted concealment, spoke to consciousness of guilt in a way that is hard to explain away. People do not scrub their floors with bleach after accidents, at least not in ways that leave the specific patterns the investigators documented. Forensic analysis of the material found in the home was consistent with the body of a child having been present in circumstances of trauma, and while forensic science is not infallible and its findings are subject to interpretation, the cumulative weight of the physical evidence at the scene corroborated key elements of the confession even as the confession itself was being challenged on the grounds of how it was obtained. But here is what investigators did not find, despite extensive and repeated searches of the property, the surrounding area, nearby farmland, water sources, and eventually areas far beyond the immediate vicinity. Despite the involvement of specialist search teams and the use of cadaver dogs and ground-penetrating radar, they did not find Joana's body. They did not find her clothing. They did not find any physical trace of her after the point where the neighbors saw her walking toward the shop, and that absence haunts the case to this day because it means that whatever happened to Joana, whatever was done with her remains, was done with a thoroughness and a deliberateness that speaks either to cold premeditation or to exactly the kind of knowledge that her family would have had about the land, the area, the places where something could be hidden and stay hidden. If you are watching this from the United States, the UK, Portugal, Brazil, Canada, or anywhere in the world right now, wherever you are tonight, please subscribe to the channel, like this video, and turn on notifications, because we are in the middle of one of the most complex and heartbreaking cases I have ever covered, and the next chapter is where everything that seemed settled begins to unravel in ways nobody expected. The processing of the crime scene, the handling of the physical evidence, and the documentation of the investigation became matters of intense controversy when defense attorneys began to pick apart the procedural record and found gaps, inconsistencies, and what they characterized as irregularities that cast doubt on the integrity of the evidence chain. In a case where the confession was already under challenge due to allegations of torture, the last thing the prosecution needed was for its physical evidence to also come under attack, but that is exactly what happened, and the combination of a contested confession and contested evidence handling left the case resting on a foundation that was far less solid than the original charges implied. And then came the revelation that transformed the Joana Cipriano case from a tragic regional crime story into a national scandal that reached the highest echelons of Portuguese law enforcement, because one of the investigators involved in the case, a senior figure in the Polícia Judiciária whose name was known and whose career had been distinguished, would himself become a defendant, charged not with finding out what happened to a little girl but with being one of the people who beat her mother into making a false confession, and that investigator's name was Goncalo Amaral, and if that name sounds familiar to you, it should, because before the Joana Cipriano case was even to avoid if you have spent any time in the lead investigator in another missing child case that would capture the attention of the entire world in 2007. Because Amaral was the lead investigator in that case as well before being removed from it, and his subsequent career as an author and commentator built on his theories about both cases has made him a figure of enormous controversy, someone with passionate defenders who see him as a truth-teller victimized by powerful interests and equally passionate critics who see him as a discredited investigator whose methods caused serious harm to innocent people. Understanding his role in the Joana Cipriano case is essential to understanding the man and the debate around him, because Joana's case was, in a very real sense, where Amaral's methods were first put under the spotlight and found seriously wanting. Amaral was a senior figure in the Polícia Judiciária's Portimão office when the Joana Cipriano case broke in September 2004, and he was involved in the investigation from early stages. When Leonor Cipriano alleged that she had been beaten during interrogation by officers under his command, when medical evidence confirmed that she had suffered serious injuries consistent with her allegations, the question of accountability fell squarely on Amaral and his team. He denied that abuse had taken place, denied that any confession had been coerced, and maintained that the investigation had been conducted properly and that the confessions obtained were genuine and reliable. The Portuguese judicial system, to its credit, did not simply accept these denials. Proceedings were opened against Amaral and several colleagues, proceedings that would drag on for years through the notoriously slow Portuguese court system, but that would ultimately result in significant consequences for Amaral's career and his credibility. The investigation of the investigator, the spectacle of a senior law enforcement figure being held accountable for the methods used against a suspect in a child disappearance case, was genuinely unprecedented in Portugal and caused enormous soul-searching within law enforcement and the judicial community. Meanwhile, the case against Leonor Cipriano and João Cipriano proceeded through the courts, their confessions central to the prosecution despite having been retracted, the physical evidence presented as corroboration, the defense maintaining throughout that everything about the case was contaminated by the method of its investigation. The question of whether a conviction could stand on evidence gathered in these circumstances was one that Portuguese courts would have to answer, and their answer, when it came, was both expected and deeply unsatisfying to everyone who wanted clear resolution. But what almost nobody knew at the time, what emerged only slowly and piece by piece through the subsequent years of legal proceedings and journalistic investigation, was the full picture of what the interrogation sessions had actually involved, the specific nature of the abuse alleged, the accounts of other people who had been present or adjacent to those sessions, and the documentary evidence that contradicted the official version of events so directly and so completely that it became impossible to maintain the fiction that proper procedures had been followed, and that evidence, when it finally came to light in its full form, did not just implicate Amaral and his colleagues, it raised questions about how many other cases in that region, over how many years, had been investigated using similar methods. Leonor Cipriano sat in a Portuguese courtroom in 2005 and faced charges that no parent should face, of murdering her own child, of disposing of her body to conceal the crime, of being the primary agent of her daughter's death. She maintained throughout that her confession had been beaten out of her, that she had not killed Joana, that she did not know what had happened to her daughter, and that the system that was supposed to find the truth had instead manufactured a convenient answer that fit the evidence it had forced her to provide. Her brother João sat beside her in the dock, facing the same charges, maintaining the same position, insisting that his confession too had been coerced and was not a reliable account of what actually happened. The prosecution's case rested on the confessions, on the physical evidence from the family home, on the forensic analysis of the blood evidence, on expert testimony about what the evidence meant, and on the argument that the details contained in the confessions could only have been known to people who were present when Joana died. The defense countered on every front, challenging the admissibility of confessions obtained through violence, questioning the chain of custody of the physical evidence, putting forward alternative interpretations of the forensic findings, and presenting medical evidence that documented Leonor's injuries in detail so stark that it was difficult for anyone in that courtroom to ignore what it suggested about how the confession had been produced. Watching from wherever you are in the world right now, whether you are in London, Lisbon, New York, Sao Paulo, Toronto, Sydney, or anywhere else on this planet, take a moment to subscribe to this channel, like this video, and turn on notifications, because what the court decided in this case, and how that decision has been litigated and relitigated in the years since, is the kind of story that defines what we believe about justice and about the institutions we trust to deliver it, and we need to talk about it honestly. The court convicted both Leonor and João. Despite the serious questions about how the confessions had been obtained, despite the challenge to the integrity of the evidence, despite the medical documentation of Leonor's injuries, the court found them guilty and sentenced them to significant terms of imprisonment. Leonor received a sentence of 16 years, João received a sentence of 18 years, the difference reflecting the court's assessment of their relative culpability based on the confession accounts and the physical evidence as interpreted. The verdict was immediately appealed, and the appeals process would stretch on for years, with convictions being upheld in some respects and challenged in others, the case moving through Portugal's court system like a stone through mud, slow and grinding and never quite coming to rest. But the conviction of Leonor and João was not the end of the story, it was barely even the middle, because even as they sat in prison maintaining their innocence, even as the appeals courts worked through their challenges to the verdict, a separate and equally extraordinary legal process was underway that would put Goncalo Amaral and his colleagues in the dock and ask the courts to decide whether the investigators of this case were themselves criminals, and the answer the courts gave to that question, when it finally came, would send shockwaves through Portuguese law enforcement that are still being felt today. There is something almost unbearable about the spectacle of a justice system putting its own people on trial for the methods used to pursue justice, something that cuts to the heart of what we mean when we say that the ends do not justify the means, that a society that tortures confessions out of suspects has lost something fundamental about its claim to deliver justice at all. When Goncalo Amaral and several of his colleagues from the Polícia Judiciária faced criminal charges relating to the treatment of Joana Cipriano during her interrogation, Portugal was confronted with exactly this spectacle, and the discomfort it caused in every institution that had to engage with it was palpable. The charges against Amaral and his colleagues centered on the physical abuse of Leonor during interrogation, abuse that the medical evidence had documented and that Leonor had described in considerable detail consistent with that evidence. The prosecution of law enforcement officers for abuse of a suspect is not common in any country. The systems that investigate crime are generally reluctant to investigate themselves with the same rigor they apply to ordinary citizens, and Portugal was no exception to this general pattern. The process was slow, the resistance within the system was significant, and the outcome when it finally came was mixed in ways that satisfied nobody. Amaral was convicted of falsifying evidence, a charge relating to his conduct in the investigation rather than directly to the physical abuse, and received a suspended sentence that meant he served no prison time. Other officers faced charges related directly to the physical abuse of Leonor and were also convicted, also receiving sentences that did not involve imprisonment in most cases. From the perspective of those who believed that the investigation had been fundamentally corrupted by the use of torture, these sentences were absurdly inadequate, a light tap on the wrist for conduct that had potentially destroyed any chance of finding real justice for Joana Cipriano. From the perspective of the officers and their defenders, even these convictions represented an unjust persecution of dedicated investigators whose only crime was working too hard to find the truth. The conviction of Amaral, even on the lesser charge of evidence falsification, effectively ended his career in the Polícia Judiciária, and by the time the verdict came, he had already been removed from the Madeleine McCann investigation, a removal that his supporters attributed to political pressure and his critics attributed to the ongoing questions about his methods and judgment. He went on to write books about both cases, to give interviews, to become a polarizing public figure, to face civil lawsuits from the McCann family, all of which lies beyond the scope of the Joana Cipriano case but all of which is impossible to fully separate from it because the Joana case is where the pattern of his methods and their consequences first became a matter of public record. But here is the question that neither the conviction of Leonor and João nor the conviction of Amaral ever fully answered, the question that sits at the center of this case like a splinter that nobody can quite get out, which is simply this: what actually happened to Joana Cipriano on the evening of September 12, 2004, because if the confessions were coerced and therefore unreliable, if the investigation was compromised from its earliest stages by methods that contaminated the evidence, if the truth was bent to fit a theory rather than the theory built around the truth, then everything we think we know about this case might be wrong, and a little girl might have disappeared into genuine mystery while the system was too busy congratulating itself on solving the case to notice. Step back from the official version for a moment, from the conviction narrative that places Leonor and João at the center of this story as killers, and ask yourself what else the evidence is consistent with, because the absence of a body, the absence of witnesses, the contamination of the confession evidence, and the irregularities in the investigation do not simply leave the official version slightly shaky, they leave the entire evidentiary landscape open enough that multiple alternative explanations remain technically possible, even if none of them have ever been proven. There are people in Portugal today, advocates, journalists, family members of the accused, who argue passionately that Joana Cipriano may not have been killed by her family at all, that she may have been the victim of a predator operating in the region, that the original lines of investigation into stranger abduction were abandoned too quickly when the family became the focus, that the tunnel vision that took hold in the investigation's early days meant that other possibilities were never properly explored. The Algarve region in 2004 was not a crime-free paradise. It had its own patterns of criminal activity, its own population of people capable of harming a child, and an 8-year-old girl walking alone in the early evening was a vulnerable target for anyone who happened to be in the wrong place at the wrong time with the wrong intentions. The fact that no stranger abductor was ever identified does not mean one did not exist. It may mean that the investigation pivoted to the family before the stranger hypothesis was adequately investigated, or it may mean that there simply was no evidence of a stranger because there was no stranger, but in a case this compromised, that distinction is genuinely hard to draw. There are also alternative theories within the family perpetrator framework that differ from the official verdict in important ways, theories that have been advanced at various points by various participants in the legal process about who within the family circle was responsible and to what degree, theories that the court's verdict does not fully capture and that the retracted confessions, in their various versions, sometimes seem to support more than the official account does. The question of exactly who did what, of the precise sequence of events, of whether this was a planned act or a terrible accident that spiraled into cover-up, is one that has never been satisfactorily answered, and without a body, without forensic evidence of cause of death, it may never be. There is one thread in this case that I want to pull on carefully, one detail that has received less attention than it deserves given how much light it might shed on the broader question of what happened and why, and it concerns something about Joanna's life in the weeks and months before her disappearance, something that people who knew the family have described in the years since. Something that changes the emotional texture of the story in a way that makes certain possibilities feel more likely than others, and understanding it requires going back to the beginning of the family's history, to the dynamics that shaped the household she lived in, to the specific pressures that were building in the weeks before she vanished. Every village has its secrets, and Figueira was no different, but the particular secrets that circulated about the Cipriano family in the years and months before Joanna's disappearance were not the harmless whispered variety, they were the kind that speak to a child in danger, to a household where things were happening behind closed doors that the community was aware of and uncomfortable about but had not acted on with sufficient urgency. People who lived near the family, who had dealings with them, who had children who played with Joanna, described a household that was chaotic, unpredictable, sometimes frightening, a place where Joanna's safety was not always assured and where the adults around her were not always capable of providing the protection she needed. Joanna herself had reportedly made comments to classmates and to at least one teacher in the period before her disappearance, comments that in retrospect carry enormous weight and that raise devastating questions about what the education system and the social services system did with the information they received. The specifics of what she allegedly said, the details that teachers reportedly passed along to social services, the response that social services made to those reports, all of this is part of the case record and all of it paints a picture of a child who was trying to communicate that something was wrong and of a series of institutions that heard the message and responded inadequately. This is not hindsight speaking, this is the record speaking, and it is one of the hardest parts of this case to sit with because it suggests that Joana Cipriano's death or disappearance was not inevitable, that there were intervention points where a different decision might have led to a different outcome. The relationship between Leonor and her brother João was described by multiple people in the village in terms that went beyond ordinary sibling closeness, terms that suggested a dependency and an enmeshment that was unusual and that cast a troubling light on the dynamics within the household where Joanna lived. Multiple witnesses would later describe specific interactions they had observed between João and members of the household that, in light of everything that followed, took on implications they had not registered at the time, implications about power and control and about who was really in charge of what happened under that roof. These witness accounts were part of the trial record but received relatively little attention compared to the drama of the confessions and the torture allegations, and that imbalance in attention may have contributed to an incomplete public understanding of the case. There is a piece of testimony in the case record that I have been thinking about since I first encountered it, testimony from someone who was close to the family in the period immediately before Joanna's disappearance, testimony that describes a specific incident in the days before the Sunday evening when she went to buy groceries and never came back. An incident that at the time seemed unremarkable but that in the context of everything that followed suggests a level of premeditation, a level of planning, that shifts the entire moral weight of this case and makes certain conclusions much harder to avoid than others. And when we examine what that testimony says and what it implies, the story of Joana Cipriano becomes both clearer and, in a way that is hard to articulate, even more heartbreaking. Let us be honest about something that true crime coverage often dances around, which is the moral and evidential complexity of the confession as a form of evidence. Confessions feel like certainty, they feel like the moment when the ambiguity of investigation resolves into the clarity of admission, when someone who was suspected becomes someone who has confirmed our suspicion, and there is a reason that confessions have historically been treated as the gold standard of criminal evidence, the queen of proofs as legal tradition once called them. But decades of wrongful conviction cases, decades of research into the psychology of interrogation and false confessions, have established beyond serious dispute that confessions are not reliable in the way we intuitively feel they should be, that people confess to things they did not do, that coercive interrogation produces false confessions with disturbing regularity, and that the very features of a confession that make it feel most convincing, its detail, its specificity, its emotional weight, can be products of interrogation rather than of genuine memory and genuine guilt. The Joana Cipriano case sits in this complexity in an especially acute way, because the confessions obtained from Leonor and João were detailed, they contained specifics, they had emotional texture, and yet they were obtained in circumstances that the courts ultimately found involved criminal conduct by the investigators, and they were retracted by both confessors almost as soon as the immediate pressure of interrogation was removed. The question of how much weight to give to a confession that checks all the boxes for reliability at the level of content while failing catastrophically at the level of the process through which it was obtained is not a question with an easy answer, it is a question that sits at the heart of jurisprudence and that different legal systems answer in different ways. The Portuguese courts, in upholding the conviction of Leonor and João despite the serious questions about the confessions, made an implicit argument that the physical evidence was sufficient corroboration to make the convictions stand even if the confessions were set aside, and that argument has some force because the blood evidence and the forensic findings at the family home are hard to explain away entirely. But the counter-argument, that the physical evidence was itself gathered and processed in circumstances compromised by the same investigation culture that produced the tortured confessions, that the chain of custody was not maintained with sufficient rigor, that alternative interpretations of the physical findings were not adequately considered, has never been satisfactorily answered. Leonor Cipriano served her sentence maintaining throughout that she was innocent, that she had not killed her daughter, that the system had failed Joana twice, first by not protecting her and then by inventing a story that satisfied the need for a conviction without necessarily reflecting the truth. Whether that maintained innocence is genuine or performative, whether she is a mother falsely convicted or a mother who killed her child and successfully shifted blame onto a compromised investigation, is something that the case record alone cannot definitively answer. And then there is the question that haunts every person who has spent time with this case, the question that has no comfortable answer and that cannot be dodged by focusing on the procedural scandals and the institutional failures, which is simply, where is Joana? Where are her remains? Where did she go on that September evening when she walked toward a shop and disappeared from every record and every witness account and every physical trace that we have been able to find, because wherever she is, whatever happened to her, she was 8 years old and she deserved better than to become the center of a controversy about police methods and judicial process. She deserved to simply grow up, and the failure to deliver any kind of answer to the question of where she is represents the final and most enduring failure of everyone who was supposed to find out. You know what's terrifying? It's not the monster hiding under your bed. It's not the serial killer in the news. It's the idea that someone you trust, someone you see every day, someone who seems completely normal, could be capable of unimaginable violence. That's what makes the Noida double murder case so disturbing. Because this isn't a story about strangers. This is a story about a family. A successful, respectable family living in a nice neighborhood. The kind of family you'd never suspect. I'm going to tell you about a case that divided an entire nation. A case where the evidence pointed in one direction, but millions of people refused to believe it. A case that's still debated 15 years later. This is about Arushi Talwar. 14 years old. Brilliant student. Talented musician. Found dead in her bedroom with her throat slit. And her parents, both successful doctors, were accused of killing her. Did they do it? The court said yes. Much of India said no. The truth? Well, that's what we're here to figure out. Before we start, let me be clear about something. This case involves the murder of a child. It involves graphic violence. It involves accusations of sexual misconduct that were never proven. It involves a media circus that destroyed lives whether the accused were guilty or not. So if you're looking for a simple answer, if you want me to tell you definitively what happened, you're going to be disappointed. Because 15 years later, nobody knows for sure. What I can tell you is what the evidence showed. What the police did and didn't do. How the investigation was botched from the beginning. How the media turned a tragedy into entertainment. And how a case that should have been about finding justice for a murdered teenager became about everything else. This is the Noida double murder case. And I'm warning you now, by the end, you might not know what to believe either. Let's begin. May 16, 2008. Noida, India. A planned satellite city near Delhi. Modern. Prosperous. Safe. L32 Jalvayu Vihar. A nice apartment complex. Doctors, engineers, business people. The kind of place where everyone knows everyone, but everyone keeps to themselves. Flat E21, first floor. Home of the Talwar family. Dr. Rajesh Talwar, dentist, successful practice. Dr. Nupur Talwar, also a dentist, works with her husband. And their daughter, Arushi. 14 years old. Class 9 student. May 16th started like any other day. Except it didn't. Nupur Talwar woke up around 6 a.m. Got ready. Went to wake her daughter for school. Arushi's bedroom door was locked from the inside. Nupur knocked. No response. She figured Arushi was sleeping deeply, the girl had stayed up late studying. Nupur didn't force it. She thought, let her sleep a bit more. She went about her morning. Made tea. Got ready for work. Around 6:30 a.m., she tried again. Knocked harder. Still no response. Now she was getting concerned. She called for the servant. Hemraj. He'd been with the family for a while. Lived in a small room on the terrace. Hemraj didn't respond either. Odd. He was usually up by now. Nupur called her husband. Rajesh came. They tried to open Arushi's door. It was definitely locked from inside. They called for Hemraj again. Where was he? Finally, they used a spare key. Opened Arushi's door. And found their daughter dead on her bed. Throat slit. Blood everywhere. A golf club lying nearby. Can you imagine? Can you imagine going to wake your child and finding that? Nupur screamed. Neighbors heard it. Rajesh called the police. The time was approximately 6:30 a.m. The police arrived. Noida police. They looked at the scene. 14-year-old girl, murdered in her bedroom. Door locked from inside. No signs of forced entry into the apartment. Where was Hemraj? They searched the house. Couldn't find him. The terrace door was locked. They couldn't access his room. The initial police theory formed quickly. Too quickly. Hemraj, the servant, must have done it. Must have killed Arushi and then fled. Simple. Case closed. They issued a lookout notice for Hemraj. Began searching for him. Meanwhile, the Talwars, destroyed by grief, tried to process what had happened. But here's where things get weird. Really weird. The next day, May 17th, someone decided to check the terrace more thoroughly. The door was locked. They broke it open and found Hemraj's body on the terrace. Throat slit. Partially decomposed. He'd been dead at least as long as Arushi. Maybe longer. So the police theory? Completely wrong. Hemraj didn't kill Arushi and run. Someone killed them both. Murdered a teenage girl and a 45-year-old man in the same house. And somehow got out without anyone noticing. The question was, who? And that's when the police did something that would haunt this case forever. They looked at the evidence. They looked at the crime scene. They looked at who had opportunity, means, motive. And they decided the parents did it. Dr. Rajesh Talwar and Dr. Nupur Talwar. Successful professionals. No criminal history. No history of violence. They just lost their only child in the most brutal way imaginable. And the police accused them of murder. The story was about to get much, much worse. But why would parents kill their own daughter? What evidence made police suspect them? And how did a case about finding a killer turn into a media circus that destroyed multiple lives? We'll find out. The investigation begins. Let's talk about how badly this investigation was bungled. Because understanding how the police screwed up is crucial to understanding why this case is still controversial. First mistake, the crime scene. When police arrived on May 16th, they didn't properly secure it. Neighbors came in. Family members were allowed to move around. Evidence was contaminated before it was even collected. The golf club near Arushi's body? Multiple people had touched it before it was photographed and bagged. The bloodstains? People had walked through them. The door locks? Tampered with by the family trying to get into rooms. This is crime scene investigation 101 stuff. And they failed it completely. Second mistake, missing Hemraj's body for a whole day. How do you not find a decomposing corpse on the terrace? The police claimed the door was locked and they couldn't access it. But come on. You have a murder scene, you search everywhere. You break down every locked door. You don't just assume the missing servant ran away. This mistake was catastrophic. Because for 24 hours, the entire investigation was based on the false assumption that Hemraj was the killer. Media reported it. Public believed it. The Talwars were told their daughter's murderer had escaped. Then, oops, actually, he's dead on your terrace. Our bad. Third mistake, the autopsy. Oh God, the autopsy. Arushi's post-mortem was conducted by Dr. Sunil Doher. The report noted the throat wound, carotid artery severed, death would have been quick. Blunt force trauma to the head, she'd been hit with something heavy before her throat was cut. But then the report included something else. Something that would become hugely controversial. The report suggested vaginal widening and claimed this indicated sexual activity. This detail was leaked to the media. And the media went insane with it. Headlines screamed about Arushi's character. About her having a boyfriend. About her parents discovering her in a compromising position and killing her in rage. Here's the problem, the autopsy finding was questioned by other medical experts. Many said vaginal widening in a teenage girl is not indicative of sexual activity. It's a normal anatomical variation. The hymen can be torn by many non-sexual activities, sports, using tampons, medical exams. But the damage was done. The media had its angle. And the Talwars, already destroyed by their daughter's murder, now had to deal with their child's reputation being destroyed too. Fourth mistake, tunnel vision. The police decided early, very early, that the parents did it. And once they decided that, they stopped looking at other possibilities. Why did they decide this? Multiple factors. The crime scene. No signs of forced entry. Doors were locked from inside. The killer would have needed access to the house, knowledge of the layout, keys to locks. The fact that the parents claimed to have heard nothing. The murders happened in their home. Arushi's room was next to theirs. Hemraj was on the terrace. How did they not hear screams, struggles, anything? The weapon. The golf club belonged to the Talwars. The knife used to slit throats was likely from their kitchen. The timing. Hemraj was killed on the terrace. His body was up there all night while the Talwars were in the flat below. How did they not know? So the police theory formed, the Talwars killed Arushi. Maybe they found her with Hemraj in a compromising situation. Maybe it was a rage killing. Then they killed Hemraj to eliminate a witness. Then they locked the terrace door, cleaned up, and pretended to discover the body in the morning. The problem with this theory? It required the Talwars to be both cold-blooded killers capable of murdering their daughter and sophisticated enough to stage a crime scene, while also being stupid enough to leave obvious evidence everywhere. It required them to commit murder in their own home with their daughter's body in the next room, then sleep peacefully through the night. It required them to be simultaneously criminal masterminds and complete idiots. But the police had decided. And they pushed forward. Rajesh Talwar was arrested on May 23, 2008. Less than a week after his daughter's murder. Charged with murder. He would spend 6 weeks in jail before being granted bail. 6 weeks of being India's most hated man. 6 weeks of media calling him a murderer. 6 weeks of losing everything, his daughter, his freedom, his reputation, his practice. And the investigation? It continued to be a mess. But Rajesh Talwar wasn't the only suspect. As the investigation stumbled forward, another theory emerged. One involving the servants. 3 men who worked in the building. 3 men who might have had motive and opportunity. Could they have been the real killers? Or was this just another dead end? While Rajesh Talwar sat in jail, another investigation was happening. Because not everyone in the police believed the parents did it. The Central Bureau of Investigation, CBI, took over the case in June 2008. And they looked at a different angle. The servants. See, Hemraj wasn't the only domestic worker in the building. There were others. And 3 of them became suspects. Krishna, Vijay Mundal, Rajkumar. All 3 worked as servants in the Jalvayu Vihar complex. All 3 knew Hemraj. All 3 had access to the building. The CBI theory, what if these 3 were drinking with Hemraj on the terrace that night? What if Arushi woke up, heard noise, came to investigate? What if the servants panicked and killed her? Then killed Hemraj to eliminate witnesses? It sounded plausible. More plausible than parents killing their daughter, honestly. The CBI found evidence supporting this theory. Witnesses who said they'd seen the 3 servants together on May 15, the night before the murders. Hemraj's phone records showing calls to and from numbers associated with the servants. The fact that all 3 servants had disappeared after the murders. They'd fled Noida. Were in hiding. The CBI tracked them down. Brought them in for questioning. And here's where things get murky. The servants were interrogated extensively. Some say they were tortured. They allegedly confessed. Then recanted. Then gave different versions of events. According to one version, they'd been on the terrace with Hemraj. Drinking. Arushi came up. She saw them. They panicked. One of them hit her with a golf club. Then slit her throat. Then killed Hemraj because he'd witnessed it. According to another version, they'd molested Arushi in her room. She screamed. Hemraj came to help. They killed both of them. But these confessions were inconsistent. The servants claimed they were coerced. The CBI couldn't corroborate key details. There was no physical evidence definitively linking them to the murders. The golf club? No fingerprints from the servants. The knife? Never found. DNA evidence? Contaminated crime scene made it unreliable. And here's the thing about this theory. It had the same problem as the parents' theory. How did 3 drunk servants commit a double murder in a small apartment without waking anyone else? How did they get in and out without being seen? How did they know the layout well enough to move around in the dark? So in 2009, the CBI did something shocking. They filed a closure report. Basically said, we can't solve this case. The evidence is too contaminated. The crime scene was too compromised. We don't have enough to charge anyone. They didn't explicitly exonerate the Talwars. But they didn't charge them either. The closure report was submitted to court in December 2010. For the Talwars, this was something. Not justice for their daughter. Not closure. Not vindication. But at least not being charged with murder. Except the story wasn't over. Because the court rejected the CBI's closure report. Said it wasn't satisfactory. Ordered the investigation to continue. And in 2013, 5 years after the murders, the Talwars were charged. Both of them. Rajesh and Nupur. Murder. Destruction of evidence. Misleading the investigation. The trial began. And it would be a circus. The trial would last months. The evidence would be picked apart piece by piece. And in the end, the verdict would shock the nation. But was it justice? Or was it a scapegoating? The answer depends on what you believe about what happened that night. November 2013. A special CBI court in Ghaziabad. Dr. Rajesh Talwar and Dr. Nupur Talwar stand trial for murdering their daughter and their servant. The prosecution's case was circumstantial. That's important to understand. There was no eyewitness. No confession. No DNA evidence definitively proving the Talwars killed anyone. What they had was a theory. A narrative. And they built it piece by piece. The prosecution's narrative went like this. On the night of May 15, 2008, Dr. Rajesh Talwar came home late from a dinner with friends. He went to Arushi's room to check on her. And he found her with Hemraj. In a compromising position. The exact nature of this position was never proven. The prosecution implied sexual activity. The defense said even if Hemraj was in the room, it didn't mean anything inappropriate was happening. But according to the prosecution, Rajesh flew into a rage. Grabbed a golf club. Hit Arushi on the head. Then hit Hemraj. Nupur heard the commotion. Came to see what was happening. Saw her husband standing over their daughter's body. Saw Hemraj injured but alive. Together, according to the prosecution, they decided to cover it up. They couldn't explain Arushi's death without revealing what Rajesh had found. So they decided to kill Hemraj too. Make it look like an outsider had killed both of them. Rajesh slit Arushi's throat with a surgical knife. Then dragged Hemraj to the terrace. Slit his throat. Locked the terrace door. Cleaned up the crime scene as best they could. Then they went to bed. Slept through the night. Woke up in the morning and discovered their daughter's body. That was the story. Cold. Calculated. Horrific if true. The defense tore it apart. First, the compromising position was never proven. It was speculation based on a discredited autopsy report. There was zero evidence Arushi and Hemraj had any inappropriate relationship. Second, the timeline didn't work. Rajesh came home around 11 p.m. The murders happened sometime between midnight and 2 a.m. based on forensic analysis. The prosecution's theory required Rajesh to discover his daughter, kill her in rage, kill Hemraj, clean up, and go to bed, all while his wife slept in the next room. Third, the weapon. The golf club had no definitive fingerprints. The knife was never found. The prosecution claimed it was a surgical scalpel that Rajesh disposed of. But they couldn't prove it. Fourth, the noise. The murders would have been loud. Violent. Screaming. Struggling. The neighbors claimed to have heard nothing. The Talwars claimed to have heard nothing. Was everyone lying? Or did the murders happen when everyone was in deep sleep? Fifth, the servants' theory was never properly investigated. The defense argued that Krishna, Vijay, and Rajkumar were far more likely suspects. They had motive, robbery, possibly assault. They had opportunity, access to the building. They had fled after the murders. Why weren't they on trial? The prosecution's response: the crime scene. The locked doors. The lack of forced entry. An outsider couldn't have done this. But the defense showed that outsiders could have gotten in. Hemraj had a key. He could have let them in. The terrace was accessible from outside. The locks were old and could be manipulated. The trial went on for months. Witnesses testified. Experts were called. Forensic evidence was debated. And throughout all of this, the Talwars maintained their innocence. They hadn't killed their daughter. They hadn't killed Hemraj. They were victims, not perpetrators. The judge, Judge Sham Lal, heard all the evidence. And on November 25, 2013, he delivered his verdict. Guilty. Both Rajesh and Nupur Talwar were found guilty of murder. Guilty of destruction of evidence. They were sentenced to life imprisonment. The courtroom erupted. The media went wild. India was divided. Some said, finally, justice for Arushi. Her parents were murderers and deserved to be punished. Others said, this is a travesty. Two innocent people were being scapegoated because the police couldn't solve the case. The Talwars were led away in handcuffs. Sent to prison. Their lives destroyed. But the story still wasn't over. Because the conviction was based on circumstantial evidence. On a theory that required believing the worst about two parents. And in 2017, the Talwars would appeal. And the appellate court would have to decide, was the evidence strong enough to convict? Or had a terrible miscarriage of justice occurred? Before we get to the appeal, we need to talk about the media. Because the media's role in this case was, let's call it problematic. From the moment Arushi's body was discovered, the media descended. TV cameras. Newspaper reporters. Everyone wanting the story. And the story they told was sensational. Lurid. Often irresponsible. Remember the autopsy report that suggested vaginal widening? That was leaked to media within days. And the coverage was disgusting. Headlines like, Arushi was sexually active. Teen's secret life. What parents didn't know. A 14-year-old murder victim was being character assassinated in the press. Her private life, or speculation about her private life, was being broadcast to millions. Then the theories started. TV channels ran investigative reports that were really just speculation dressed up as journalism. One theory, Arushi was having an affair with Hemraj. Her parents found out and killed them both in an honor killing. Another theory, Arushi had a boyfriend. The parents disapproved. They killed her to preserve family honor. Zero evidence for any of this. But it was broadcast as fact. The Talwars were tried and convicted in the court of public opinion long before they ever saw a courtroom. Their photos were on every channel. Their lives were dissected. Every detail of their marriage, their practice, their parenting was examined and found wanting. Reporters camped outside their home. Followed them to court. Shouted questions. Did you kill your daughter? How does it feel to be a murderer? And here's the thing, the media coverage influenced the investigation. Police felt pressure to make an arrest. So they arrested Rajesh Talwar before they had solid evidence. The media coverage influenced the trial. The judge would later say he'd been influenced by societal perception. He'd convicted based partly on how the case looked, not just the evidence. Some journalists did responsible reporting. But many didn't. Many treated a double murder like entertainment. Like a soap opera with real people's lives as the plot. There were TV shows analyzing the case. Debates with experts who'd never seen the actual evidence. Reenactments with actors playing Arushi and her parents. True crime specials that presented theory as fact. The Talwars couldn't defend themselves. They were grieving parents who'd lost their child. They didn't want to talk to media. And their silence was taken as guilt. Why aren't they crying on camera? Why don't they defend themselves? Innocent people would be screaming their innocence. As if there's a right way to grieve. As if devastated parents should perform their trauma for cameras. The media also pushed the honor-killing narrative hard. And this is important to understand in the Indian context. Honor killings do happen in India. Families, usually in rural, conservative areas, sometimes kill daughters who violate cultural norms. Dating outside caste or religion. Choosing their own partners. Being too modern. So when the media suggested this was an honor killing, it played into existing prejudices. It made the case fit a familiar narrative. The problem? The Talwars didn't fit the profile. They were urban, educated, liberal. Nupur had said in interviews that she wouldn't mind if Arushi had a boyfriend when she was older. They weren't conservative parents who'd kill to preserve honor. But nuance doesn't sell newspapers. Successful doctors commit honor killing is a better headline than unsolved double murder with contaminated evidence. The media circus had real consequences. It made it harder for the Talwars to get a fair trial. It traumatized their extended family. It turned their daughter's murder into entertainment. And it influenced public opinion so thoroughly that even when the Talwars were acquitted on appeal, many people refused to believe they were innocent. Because the media had told them otherwise. For years. Speaking of the appeal, let's talk about what happened in 2017 when the case went to the Allahabad High Court. Because that verdict would be very different. Before we continue, I need you to think about something. This case, this tragedy, what does it teach you? Because this isn't just about one murder. It's about how investigations can be bungled. How media can destroy lives. How prejudice and assumptions can override evidence. So I want to hear from you. In the comments, tell me. What are you learning from the Noida case? About how investigations should and shouldn't be conducted? About the media's responsibility when covering crime? About the danger of assuming guilt before trial? And here's the harder question, if you were on a jury, how would you decide? The evidence is circumstantial. The parents look suspicious. But there's reasonable doubt. How much doubt is reasonable? When do you convict? Share your thoughts. Because understanding this case means understanding these bigger issues. And if you're finding this case as fascinating and disturbing as I am, hit that subscribe button. Because we're only halfway through this story, and it gets even more complicated. Now, let's talk about the appeal. October 12, 2017. The Allahabad High Court. 9 years after Arushi's murder. 4 years after the Talwars were convicted. Justice B.K. Narayana and Justice A.K. Mishra were hearing the appeal. The question before them: did the trial court have enough evidence to convict the Talwars beyond reasonable doubt? The appeal focused on several key points. Point 1. The crime scene. The defense argued that the crime scene investigation was so badly botched that no reliable conclusions could be drawn from it. Evidence was contaminated. Chain of custody was broken. Photos were taken after the scene had been tampered with. You can't base a murder conviction on compromised evidence. That's fundamental to justice. Point 2. The murder weapon. The prosecution never found the knife used to slit throats. They theorized it was a surgical scalpel that Rajesh disposed of. But they never proved this. The golf club had no clear fingerprints linking it to the Talwars. Convicting someone of murder when you haven't found the murder weapon? That requires very strong circumstantial evidence. Did they have it? Point 3. Motive. The prosecution's motive, that Rajesh found Arushi with hemorrhage and killed them in rage, was based entirely on speculation. There was zero evidence of any inappropriate relationship between Arushi and hemorrhage. The autopsy's sexual activity claim had been debunked. So what was the motive? Why would successful doctors with no history of violence suddenly commit a brutal double murder? Point 4. Alternative suspects. The servants, Krishna, Vijay Mundal, Rajkumar, were never properly investigated. They had fled after the murders. They had given inconsistent statements. But the trial court had dismissed them as suspects without adequate analysis. The defense argued, if there are other plausible suspects, you can't convict our clients beyond reasonable doubt. Point 5. Circumstantial evidence standard. This is crucial. In Indian law, you can convict on circumstantial evidence alone. But the circumstances must be so strong that they exclude every other reasonable hypothesis except guilt. Did the evidence against the Talwars meet that standard? Or were there other reasonable explanations for the facts? The appellate judges examined the trial court's verdict carefully. And they found problems. Judge Shamlal's original verdict had relied heavily on assumptions. Assumption: the locked doors meant only the parents could have committed the murders. But the defense showed the locks could be manipulated. Hemraj had keys. The terrace was accessible from outside. Assumption: the Talwars' behavior after discovering the body was suspicious. But people in shock don't behave rationally. There's no correct way to react to finding your child murdered. Assumption: the parents must have heard something if murders happened in their home. But the flat was air-conditioned. Doors were closed. People sleep deeply. It's possible they heard nothing. The appellate court's conclusion: the trial court had filled gaps in evidence with assumptions. Had assumed guilt rather than requiring the prosecution to prove it beyond reasonable doubt. On October 12, 2017, the Allahabad High Court acquitted Dr. Rajesh Talwar and Dr. Nupur Talwar. They were innocent. Free to go. After 4 years in prison. The verdict was detailed. Over 200 pages. It methodically tore apart the prosecution's case. The prosecution has been able to prove some circumstances against the accused. But there are certain other circumstances that may point to some other person as the possible accused. It is a matter of common sense that the prosecution cannot base its case on weak and strong circumstances and lead evidence to that effect and expect the court to absolve the prosecution from the duty to prove its case beyond reasonable doubt. Translation: you can't convict on maybes. You can't convict on assumptions. You need proof beyond reasonable doubt. And the prosecution didn't have it. The Talwars walked out of court. For years of their lives gone. Their daughter still dead. Her real killer, or killers, still unknown. They were free. But were they vindicated? That depends on who you ask. Because the acquittal didn't prove they were innocent. It proved there wasn't enough evidence to convict them. Those are different things. Some people celebrated the acquittal. Said justice had finally been done. An innocent couple had been freed. Others were furious. Said dangerous murderers had been let off on a technicality. That the Talwars had gotten away with murder. The truth? We still don't know. And that's what makes this case so haunting. So if the Talwars didn't do it, who did? Let's examine the evidence and theories one more time. Because somewhere in this mess is the truth about what really happened on May 15, 2008. Let's be honest. Let's look at this objectively. What does the evidence actually suggest? Theory 1, the Talwars did it. Here's the case for their guilt. The crime scene, no forced entry. Doors locked from inside. Arushi's door locked from inside her room. The terrace door locked from inside. Whoever did this had access, had keys, knew the layout. Who fits that description? The parents. The timing, the murders happened while the Talwars were home. In a small apartment. Arushi's room was next to her parents' room. How did they not hear anything? Either they heard nothing because they're very deep sleepers in an air-conditioned, insulated flat. Or they heard nothing because they were the ones doing it. The behavior, the morning after. Nupur found her daughter dead and her first instinct was to, what? Call for Hemraj? Why? If you find your child murdered, you call police immediately. You scream. You panic. The defense said she was in shock. But it does seem odd. The weapon, the golf club, was theirs. The knife was likely from their kitchen. Even if you argue an outsider could have used their implements, it's still suspicious. The cleanup, the crime scene showed signs of cleanup. Selective cleaning, some blood wiped away, some left. Why would an outsider clean up? They'd flee. But a family member might try to stage the scene. Make it look different than it was. The Hemraj factor, Hemraj's body wasn't found immediately. It was on the terrace all day while the Talwars were home. How did they not know? How did they not smell decomposition? How did they not check the terrace when he was missing? Unless they knew exactly where he was. Because they'd put him there. The motive, okay, the prosecution's honor killing theory was weak. But there could be other motives we don't know about. Maybe there was an argument that escalated. Maybe Hemraj had seen something, knew something, and had to be silenced. Maybe it wasn't premeditated but a rage killing followed by panic and cover-up. The lying, the Talwars' statements to police had inconsistencies. Small ones, but they were there. About timing, about what they did that morning, about who was where when. Innocent people can have inconsistent memories, especially under trauma. But lying about details suggests consciousness of guilt. If you believe all of this, if you weight it heavily, the parents look guilty. Two doctors, smart enough to nearly pull off the perfect murder. Nearly. But there's another theory. One that explains all the same evidence without requiring parents to murder their child. And it's equally plausible. Theory 2, Krishna, Vijay Mundal, and Rajkumar did it. Here's how this theory works. The setup, May 15, 2008. Evening. Hemraj is on the terrace. He's off duty. He invites his friends, the 3 servants who work in the complex, to join him. They drink. They hang out. This wasn't unusual. Servants in the complex knew each other. They'd drink together sometimes on their off hours. The crime, sometime after midnight, one of them decides to rob the Talwar flat. Or maybe they just want to mess around. They're drunk, inhibitions lowered. Hemraj has keys. Or knows how to get in. They enter the apartment. Quietly. The Talwars are asleep. They go to Arushi's room. Why? Maybe they think there's money or jewelry there. Maybe one of them had noticed Arushi before, had inappropriate thoughts. Maybe it's random. Arushi wakes up. Sees strangers in her room. Starts to scream. One of them panics. Grabs the golf club leaning against the wall. Hits her. Hits her hard to stop her screaming. Then realizes what he's done. Hemraj comes into the room. He's heard the noise. He sees what's happened. He's panicking too. The servants realize, Hemraj can identify them. He knows them. He'll talk. They can't leave him alive. They drag him to the terrace. They have to kill him too. One of them, or maybe all of them in a frenzy, cuts both victims' throats with a kitchen knife to make sure they're dead. Then they flee. Run. Leave Noida. Go into hiding. The evidence. The locked doors, the servants had access to keys. Hemraj could have let them in. Or they could have locked doors behind them as they left to delay discovery. The noise. If the Talwars were in deep sleep in an air-conditioned bedroom with doors closed, they might not have heard a quick attack. Arushi could have been unconscious from the head blow before she could scream much. The cleanup, there wasn't much cleanup. The scene was bloody. An outsider wouldn't stick around to clean. They'd just run. Which is what the scene looks like. The flight, all three servants fled after the murders. Disappeared. That's consciousness of guilt right there. The motive. Robbery gone wrong. Or sexual assault attempted and interrupted. Both are sadly common motives. The phone records, the CBI found evidence these three were in contact with Hemraj before the murders. The confessions, yes, they recanted. Yes, they claimed coercion. But they did confess. And confessions, even unreliable ones, suggest something. If you believe this theory, the Talwars are innocent. Tragic victims. They lost their daughter and then were falsely accused because the police couldn't solve the case. The Real killers walked free because the investigation was bungled from day one. But there are problems with this theory too. Problems that make you question everything. Because if the servants did it, why wasn't there more forensic evidence? Why were their confessions so inconsistent? And why would they risk murder when they could have just run after the first attack? Here's what keeps me up at night about this case. The questions that have no good answers. Question 1, the golf club. Forensic analysis of the golf club was inconclusive. There were blood traces, but contamination made it unclear whose blood. There were no clear fingerprints. If the parents did it, why would Rajesh use his own golf club and leave it at the scene? If the servants did it, how did they know to grab that specific club in the dark? How did they know where it was? Question 2. The knife. Never found. The prosecution theorized it was a surgical scalpel that Rajesh disposed of. But they never proved this. They never found it. If the parents did it, where is the knife? They had time to dispose of it, sure. But where? It's never been found. If the servants did it, did they take it with them? Why take the knife but leave the club? Question 3, the terrace door. It was locked from inside. The key was found inside the flat. If the parents did it, this makes sense. They dragged Hemraj's body to the terrace, locked the door, kept the key inside. If the servants did it, how did they lock the door from inside and then leave? Did Hemraj lock it before he was killed? Why would he do that? Question 4, the noise. This is the big one. The Talwar's bedroom was next to Arushi's. The walls weren't that thick. Even with AC on, even in deep sleep, how did they hear nothing? If the parents did it, obviously they heard it because they were doing it. If the servants did it, this is harder to explain. But possible. People in deep sleep can miss a lot. And if the attack was quick, head blow rendering Arushi unconscious before she could scream much, maybe it was quiet enough. Question 5. The morning after. Nupur's behavior that morning. First she knocked on Arushi's door. No answer. She didn't break it down immediately. She called for Hemraj. Went about her morning. Then tried again. If the parents did it, this was staging. Trying to appear normal. If they're innocent, this is a mother assuming her teenage daughter is sleeping in. Not immediately jumping to, my child has been murdered. Which is, normal. Who thinks that? Question 6. The Hemraj discovery. The police didn't find Hemraj's body for 24 hours. It was on the terrace. The door was locked. But come on, you have a murder scene, you search everywhere. How did the Talwars not insist on checking the terrace when Hemraj was missing? How did they not think to look there? If they did it, because they knew he was dead up there and were hoping the body wouldn't be found quickly. If they're innocent, because they were traumatized, in shock, and not thinking clearly. They assumed Hemraj had run away, which is what police initially told them. Question 7. The forensics. The forensic evidence was compromised. Contaminated. Unreliable. This is agreed upon by everyone. But whose fault is that? The police for bungling the crime scene. That much is clear. But did the Talwars contribute to contamination? By moving around the flat that morning? By touching things before police arrived? Or were they just in shock, doing what any parent would do when finding their child's body? Question 8. The CBI flip. The CBI initially investigated the servants. Found enough to consider them suspects. Then filed a closure report saying they couldn't solve the case. Then the court rejected the closure report. Ordered them to continue. And suddenly the CBI charged the Talwars. What changed? Did they find new evidence? Or did they feel pressure to charge someone, anyone? Question 9. The motive. If the Talwars did it, what was the actual motive? Not the sensationalized, honor-killing theory. What would make two successful, educated people murder their only child? The prosecution never adequately answered this. And motive matters. If the servants did it. Robbery or assault. Those are clear motives. But why kill Hemraj, their friend? Why not just run after killing Arushi? Question 10. The certainty. Here's my biggest question. How can anyone be certain about what happened? The evidence is contaminated. The investigation was bungled. There were multiple possible suspects. The case was tried in the media before it got to court. How can anyone, prosecution, defense, judges, public, be absolutely certain of guilt or innocence? And yet people are certain. Completely certain. On both sides. Some people are convinced the Talwars are murderers who got away with it. Others are convinced they're innocent victims of a miscarriage of justice. How can we be so certain about something so uncertain? That's what haunts me about this case. But let's try to be objective. Let's look at what we can actually prove versus what we're assuming. Because the difference between those two things is everything.